Here is a recent photograph of the faculty and staff of the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. You can see we're very large. 45 individual faculty from many components of Washington University contribute to the ADRC, and 85 staff. You notice this is not just neurology, that's my department at Washington University, but 20 different departments, and not just at the School of Medicine, but also the Danforth campus, from psychology to social work to political science to chemistry. We're a very interdisciplinary. We have some new staff that I'd like to introduce to you. First, Becky Cusinelli, Nicole Elmore, and Connie Mayo. So where's Becky? Where's Becky? Becky is in the back, in the corner. Connie is over here waving her hand, and Nicole is? Nicole is there. Our new additions to our nursing staff. Both Becky and Connie are nurse clinicians, and Nicole Elmore is our nurse practitioner. Is Sonia Calathavito here? She's a new addition to something I'm going to be talking about in a little bit, called clinical trials, and she's a brand new addition to the team there. And then Justin Long is completing his neurology residency. He's a neurologist and a scientist, and in July he's going to join our team as a postdoctoral fellow. Some people are moving on. Cole Bolton, who is a psychometric, part of the psychometric team administering the cognitive test, has a graduate degree program that he's going to be joining in Florida at the end of the summer. Dr. Ji-Young Han is completing her postdoctoral fellowship and will be moving on to a position at the University of Massachusetts in Worcester, Mass. And Tim Holden is another postdoctoral fellow, a geriatrician, who's going to remain at Washington University and join the Division of Geriatrics. Many of you may remember Angela Oliver, another nurse clinician who left the program for another position at Washington University. So the Knight ADRC has been an entity since 1985, so we've been around a long time, and we have benefited from our interactions with many community partners. Many, not all, are listed here. So the St. Louis chapter of the Alzheimer Association, our African American Advisory Board, Links Incorporated, the Washington University's Harvey A. Friedman Center for Aging, Washington University's Hope Center for Neurologic Disorders, and Barnes Jewish Hospital Foundation, very important. We are very fortunate to be funded by the National Institute on Aging to do our research on Alzheimer's disease. But to be blunt, the National Institute on Aging funds about 70% of what we do. The remaining 30% come largely from philanthropy. And I want you to notice the donors at Barnes Jewish Hospital Foundation, Mr. Robert Willman and his wife, and at Washington University. We're very, very well supported by our School of Medicine and the school overall. At the very bottom are very substantial supporters of our program. Listed there. I won't go through them all. But there's a reason that our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center is the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, because over 10 years ago, Charles and Joanne Knight recognized the need to support Alzheimer research through our research studies. And they have been most generous supporters and continue to be most generous supporters of our program. Unfortunately, we lost Chuck last year, ironically, due to Alzheimer's disease. But with us tonight is Joanne and her family, remarkable supporters, and one of her family members is here, Ann Davidson, her daughter. So will we please recognize Joanne and Ann. We're going to have 4 presentations besides me today, so if you can tolerate me, there's hope coming. We're going to talk about returning results of some of the imaging studies that have been done. We're going to hear about a blood test for Alzheimer's disease, a potential blood test. I know many of you would be reluctant not to have your regular spinal tap, but instead to have a blood test, but we're working towards that. We're very much interested in being certain that our research volunteers reflect the community that we serve. It's unfortunate, in a way, in the Alzheimer world that most all research is largely done in volunteers who are non-Hispanic white people. And if we only study non-Hispanic white people, we'll only learn about Alzheimer's disease in that population. So we need to have our research volunteers reflect the diversity of our community here in St. Louis. And Washington University School of Medicine is aware of this need as well, and we're happy to have Daniel Blash from the Diversity and Inclusion Office speak to us. And then finally, as she has done for many years now, Dr. Joy Snyder is going to provide an update for us on what are the new investigational drugs that are being evaluated in our program. I mentioned how fortunate we are to be the recipient of 4 large grants from the National Institute on Aging. The downside of that is we're awarded a grant for only 5 years at a time, and then we have to reapply to extend it for another 5 years. So I'll just point out that one of our grants, HASD, began in 1984. So we're really over 35 years into that study. And it's going to, this budget cycle will end next year in April. So in preparation for that, we had to submit a new application for another 5 years of funding in January of this year. And it will be reviewed by our peers, and we'll find out whether it's successful in the fall. Another one of our grants is going to end, Diane, is going to end in 2019, so we're in the midst of preparing its renewal application, which is due September 2018. Then the actual ADRC grant is going to end in April of 2020, but that means we have to prepare a renewal grant to go in May of next year. And then our adult children's study grant ends in 2021, but we have to put in a renewal grant in 2020. So you can see from January of this year through September of this year through May of this year through January of the following year, we're continually writing grant renewals. Now, so far, we have been blessed. We've had every grant renewed in every 5-year cycle, and we hope, fingers crossed, that that continues. So we're interested in Alzheimer's disease and other dementing illnesses of older adults, but our particular focus has to do on identifying Alzheimer's disease prior to any symptoms of the disorder. That is, in people who are perfectly normal with their memory and thinking, have no complaints, have no problems. We know that about a third of people over 70 of that normal group of older adults already is beginning in their brain to develop Alzheimer's disease. It builds up silently in the brain for maybe 20 or 25 years before it produces symptoms. Now, when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, everyone thinks about the person who is losing their memory and thinking and having to be cared for more and more. That phase of Alzheimer's disease, the symptom phase of Alzheimer's, the dementia phase of Alzheimer's, is the end stage of a process that overall may be going on for 30 years. So we want to identify this silent phase, we call it preclinical Alzheimer's disease, using biomarkers and try to identify when we might administer drugs that could prevent or at least delay the appearance of the symptoms of the disease, prevent dementia. So we're quite interested in this prevention strategy. We have a number of scientific questions that we ask about this that drive our research. I want to talk a little bit about you. We follow at the Memory and Aging Project of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center about 900 individuals. The two grants I just mentioned, HASD and ADRC, look at people 65 and older. We have about 500 of those individuals. The Adult Children Study, 45 and older, about 300. And our Diane grant, a little over 100. We see people in the Memory and Aging Project as young as 19 and as old as 101. So in essence, we are studying this process throughout the lifespan, adult lifespan. About 57% of you are women, 16% are African American. We've had one active individual who just completed their 30th annual assessment, and two just completed their 29th annual assessment. So that's a remarkable record. And people are not just from St. Louis. Of course, St. Louis is our primary community, but because of the uniqueness of our research, we get people from across the United States, including, I thought Alaska was on here. What happened to Alaska? I think Alaska should be on here, but Idaho, Maine, California, and Texas. Okay, so this is just some characterization of our participants who are not in the Diane study, but the other three studies. So you can see that the focus, the first column of CDR0 means healthy individuals, no memory and thinking problems. You can see by far and away that's the major group of individuals who we study. We do see people who have mild symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, mild Alzheimer's disease dementia, as noted by CDR 0.5 and CDR 1, but the focus is primarily on healthy folks. We always request your help in trying to continue to get new individuals to participate in our research, family members, friends. Notice that for 2018, we're not quite halfway through, that we're doing well in our goal of recruiting healthy people. We have about half of them already, and we want to get every year 20 new African Americans, and we're slightly ahead of schedule for that as well. But we need more healthy people and more African American healthy people, so please, as I say, contact friends or family, and we will be happy to explain the research participation and see if they're interested. You note that we particularly are lagging in recruiting people with the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease dementia. So please, if you know of folk who may be interested and eligible, please call the phone number listed there so that we can see if they wish to participate. We need your help. Okay, so I skipped ahead a couple slides. I'll go back and talk about the other two in just a moment. We study people over time. So you saw 3 people, 29 years, every year or longer. If people are younger than 65, we don't expect much change in memory and thinking, so we follow them every 3 years. But why do we study people over time? By the way, the technical term for this is longitudinal, over time. Because understanding Alzheimer's disease requires evaluating how people change over time. Let me try to illustrate this. So you'll see over here something that says factor score. This is the memory and thinking performance of all the healthy people in our program. And a factor score of 0 means that that person is scoring as well as the average of all those 500 healthy people I talked about. Now, some people, when they come to our study, are scoring higher than the average of our healthy people. Some are scoring lower. On this slide, I'm showing you the performance of 2 of you. In red, the square is a man, and he's right at the average of all of the 500 healthy people. The diamond in yellow is a woman, and she's at the lower end. She's not scoring as well as the average of our healthy people. So we might think that what we learn from studying the man in red, in terms of his memory and thinking performance, in terms of his brain images, in terms of his spinal fluid analysis, his contribution would be part of our normal understanding. He would be normal. And the woman, we would expect, would develop dementia. So all of her information we would cast as being impaired. But let's see what happened to them over time. So the man declined. Matter of fact, declined quite severely. He has Alzheimer's disease dementia. The woman never improved, but she never declined. She's stable. So in fact, if we had considered back here this man's information to represent normal, we'd be dead wrong. And if we thought that she would be abnormal, we would still be dead wrong. We have to follow people over time to know how to interpret all of the information that we collect over you. The major challenge to any study over time is we fail to capture information. So if we hadn't captured any information on these 2 individuals, we'd be mistaken. So I'm going to now, this is the sober part of my presentation, point out to you that we have 31 Alzheimer's disease centers, ADCs, funded by the National Institute on Aging throughout the country. And they all enroll research volunteers, just as we do. And what happens to them, those research volunteers, after they've had their initial assessment? They're supposed to come back every year, follow up, F/U, follow up, and look at the rates of follow-up for the other Alzheimer's disease centers. It's about 80%. About 20% miss those follow-up assessments. Look at our rates. About 30%, even higher. So whereas I, again, compliment you because you contribute more data than anyone else across the country in terms of all the imaging that we do, all the blood and spinal fluid analysis, all the memory and thinking testing, If you don't return, we are losing important information. We may misclassify people. We may lose the opportunity to know how this disease progresses. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Let's see, I think I did that one. Did that one? Yeah. Okay. So I say how well characterized you are. Let's take a look at how many of you completed amyloid PET scan in 2015. A little more than half. 2016, 2017, about 2/3. Our goal is 80%. So we're not there. Spinal fluid, CSF. We're better there, about 60%. Our goal is 70%. Brain MRI, we're better there. We're about 77%. But it's not optimal. I think I did this. Plus, when I say we're funded by the National Institute on Aging, we have to justify to this government office the number of participant assessments that we plan for each year. And they give us the budget to do that. They don't give us extra budget. So if somebody, one of you, misses an assessment, then we have to add a future assessment to bring you back to make it up. We don't have the funds to do that. We have one shot at seeing you. And there's a lot that goes into arranging these assessments. I put down here all the personnel that are involved, and people put aside time that they're going to be present at the Memory and Aging Project for evaluation, so forth, the materials, the equipment. That's all lost if we don't have people come back for their assessments. Now, I think, my wife would not necessarily agree, but I think I'm realistic. You're volunteers. You can do what you want. We don't have any, you don't have any obligation to continue to get your assessments. You can decide to stop at any time. Plus, things happen. People get sick, or their family members get sick, or they have other things, a new grandchild, so forth. We understand that. People can't always make their assessments. But here are the facts. For the first 3 months of this year, we were given 260 assessment slots, but we only completed 186. 74 of you had been scheduled to come in those months, but then canceled. And as I say, we don't have funding to make that up. It's really difficult for us when we arrange for a Saturday assessment and people cancel, because our staff comes in uniquely on that day and they won't do anything that day, but then the following week we have to give them time off and to thank them for their Saturday time. So we lose them on that Saturday day when there's a cancellation. They don't do anything, and they're off for a commensurate amount of time during the week. Here are the reasons for the volunteers canceling their assessments. Now, I'm not talking about people who were said, listen, this year my health is really bad. I don't want to come in for my assessment this year, but call me next year. I'm talking about people who said, okay, I'll come in, and then they cancel. Here are the reasons. Okay? People get sick. We understand that. Scheduling conflicts. We understand that too. Well, sort of. Transportation problems. Bad weather. Oh, I forgot about it. Now, those are the people we really want to study here. Okay, what are we doing about it? And by the way, we know, believe me, we know that we ask a great deal from you. So we appreciate what you do for us. It is remarkable. But we want to be better. We want your satisfaction with our program to help us point to things we can do better. And we have a formal survey that's going around. It should be completed this fall, that gets your input into how we can better serve you. We have a remarkable group of physicians and nurses who do our assessments, and we are giving you access, just the participants, access to our clinical team if you have any questions about memory or aging or dementia. We've gone from a taxi, which we found to be suboptimal, to a town car for people who need transportation. We are rewarding or acknowledging people who have been in the program for 5-year epochs, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, so on, with service pins. And I know some of you here are wearing your service pin. It was great to see that. I appreciate that. We are giving you what many of you want, your own research results. Now, we're doing it very slowly, and the first presentation will explain why, but we are doing it, and we intend to continue to do it. And then some of you have had, in the past year or so, have had some memory and thinking assessments, and we're giving you a secret incentive, a chocolate bar. If you complete your testing, you got it, yeah. How many of you have had that chocolate bar? Yeah. Here is our contact information. Please call if you have any questions or anything, including problems. I'm not going to answer the phone, but if it's a problem, I will hear about it, and I will address it. So feel free to call. Without you, we cannot defeat Alzheimer's disease. So your satisfaction and your continued participation is the most important thing we can do. If you're unhappy about something, let us know. Now, this is confusing to me. There's a second phone number that I don't recognize. Krista? What is this phone number up here?
Is that yourself?
No. Oh, this is a special line. So the front desk line is that one I showed earlier, 286-2683. This line will get you right into someone who's going to give you feedback. I would call the front desk. But if you go to the website, this is what the website looks like. There is an opportunity, if you will click up there, it will say suggested sites, and it will take you to the feedback site. This is what the form looks like on the website. And if you have you want to ask our clinician any question about memory or thinking, you can ask the expert, and we'll get back to you that way as well. So again, there's the Knight ADRC website address, and you can go to Ask the Expert. We're trying to gain your trust because we are asking so much from you. We're working continuously to be more responsive to you and to be certain that we have you as our research partners. We're trying to give you information. We've developed fact sheets about various things that we ask you to do, and specifically for the spinal tap or lumbar puncture. And we're trying to make certain that this information is useful to you so that you don't think things that aren't quite right. So let me talk a little bit about complications of a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture. So about 20 to 25% of people report, we investigate this, as you can imagine, very carefully, report some side effect. But I would say the vast majority, 85%, are really minor side effects and go away, transient. They are feeling faint, feeling ill in the stomach, maybe back or neck pain, maybe dizziness. Believe it or not, that rate of 22% is the same as if you go to your doctor's office and get a blood drawn. So we don't have lumbar puncture. The complications is about equivalent to getting a blood draw. Now, some people get a headache, and I want to talk about that. And any of you who have had a lumbar puncture know that our staff and Dr. Fagan's laboratory, particularly Sushi, will give you all kinds of information and will follow up with you to see if you're experiencing any of this. There's after the spinal tap, post-lumbar puncture headache, often people will have a headache that goes away in a day or two and doesn't relate to their own body position. We recommend that people rest after a lumbar puncture. Don't do anything strenuous. If they get a headache, usually Tylenol, acetaminophen can handle it. Sometimes coffee can help. Occasionally there is a headache that doesn't occur when the person is lying down, but when they get up, they get the headache. That's called a positional headache, and that can be difficult. It's very hard to go to work when you're lying in bed. So that's a problem. We agree. This is rare, but when it happens, we can fix it with a blood patch. It's a procedure we do. It's very much like a lumbar puncture, but it repairs the reason that people get this headache after a lumbar puncture. Now, we very much want to do this if people need care, blood patch. We want to do it at Barnes Jewish Hospital, our medical center, because there we can ensure, or at least try to ensure, that you're not going to get charged. If you go to your own hospital, we don't have that sort of pull. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, what's on the horizon? I think I mentioned on the reverse side of the first page of your handout are these affiliated studies, and there will be tables after this program is over with these individuals there to answer questions about these programs. We hope that there will be a new affiliated study that's going to examine falls in our research volunteers, because we think that maybe in this preclinical stage of Alzheimer's, when the brain changes of Alzheimer's are building up before any dementia, then it may make people more susceptible to falls. And so if this grant is awarded, you may be asked whether you want to participate. It's up to you if you do. But it will be someone coming to your home to assess your motor abilities, what you're doing, and if there's anything in the home that may be contributing to falls. And we'll ask you to keep a monthly calendar if you've had a fall or not. We're doing a number of new studies. One is, I'd say about 93% of people who have Alzheimer's disease dementia are age 70 and older. So it's primarily a disease of the elderly, or the older adults. Heck, I'm 70, so let's say of young adults who are older. But there are some people who get it below age 65, 60, even 55, 45. And so a national study is being led from Indiana University, but Dr. Greg Day here at Washington University is going to be a site leader for that, and he's going to enroll some individuals to do that. We're collaborating with other Alzheimer's disease research centers. Emory University in Atlanta shares our interest in studying cerebral spinal fluid in African Americans, so we're going to share resources. And we've just become a site in a national study of Down syndrome. Now, some of you who are familiar with Down syndrome may know or may not know that a lot of advances have been made in the health of Down syndrome individuals who often have cardiac difficulties and previously had short lifespans. But now more individuals with Down syndrome are living longer because of these advances in healthcare. And by age 40, everybody with Down syndrome will develop Alzheimer's disease. So it's a very powerful risk factor, and we're trying to find out about that. So we're part of that study as well. In October, we're having a national workshop in conjunction with the 13th annual Norman R. Say Lecture to evaluate more effective strategies for Alzheimer's disease research programs to be welcoming to African Americans. It will be held at the School of Medicine, and we'll have representatives, as I say, from all the Alzheimer's Disease Center, the National Institute on Aging, the National Alzheimer's Association, the local Greater Missouri chapter, and many, many other stakeholders. And we hope to come up, at the very bottom of this, is to come up with some strategic methods to improve our ability to attract African Americans to participate in research. Now, I mentioned the African American Advisory Board earlier as one of our partners. Many of the advisory board members are here today and have been extremely helpful in trying to help us, the Alzheimer's Center, become more welcoming. I'd like the Alzheimer's Disease Center, Research Center, African American Advisory Board members, if you wouldn't mind standing so we can give you our recognition. So please stand up. This is not fake news. Some of you will remember 2011 in Sendai, Japan, a tsunami. And very near Sendai was that Fukushima nuclear reactor that was problematic. That's the size of that tsunami. That's not doctored. So you can see the devastation. We call this the silver tsunami because our population in the United States is getting older. And we have no effective therapies to treat Alzheimer's disease dementia. None. It will overwhelm our medical care capacity, our public health capacity, if more and more people get older, more and more people develop the disease, we have no effective therapies. So I show this just to tell you how much we appreciate your efforts to allow us to do research so that one day we can have truly effective therapies. Thank you very much. So Sarah Hartz and her colleague Jessica Mozurski in the Department of Psychiatry at Washington University are very interested in providing you with your individual research results. They've just completed a pilot study, an early study to find out how to do this, and Sarah is here today to talk about this. So let's welcome Dr. Hartz.
Thank you. So I wanted to focus today on why this is even something that's difficult to do. Why can't we just hand everybody... I'm sorry, can you hear me now? So I want to focus on why it's difficult to give research results. Why can't we just hand everybody everything that we do? Because that's not always clear. And so there are multiple reasons why disclosing research results is an issue. The first one is that part of what we're doing is we're doing research tests, and we don't know what they mean. So they're non-clinical tests. We don't know how to interpret them, and that's partly why we're studying them. The second reason is because the interpretation of the tests can be difficult. So, for example, my colleague, Jessica Mozurski, she led a study of people who were in the A4 trial. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. That was a trial to to test a drug for Alzheimer's disease. And what their trial required was a PET amyloid imaging and normal cognitive functioning. So people who were normal went in and they got a PET amyloid scan, and they had to be told whether or not the PET amyloid scan was normal or abnormal. So part of it is that the PET amyloid scan is clinically approved for diagnosing individuals with Alzheimer's disease, but only in the context of already seeing symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So these are people who don't have symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, but do have some imaging, something seen on imaging that would be more consistent with Alzheimer's disease. And so it's really hard to know how to counsel these people because we don't know exactly what it means, because PET amyloid imaging hasn't been around for a long time. So what this paper showed was that even though these people were told the results of their imaging study, what they really wanted was more information, more details, more explanation of the risk, and it's just hard to know how to do that. And so what we're trying to do is improve communication and figure out how to give people results in such a way that we can communicate everything that's accurate, but not give false information. The other concern that we have with research results is that, especially for when we're studying Alzheimer's disease, which is a disease of memory and thinking, it turns out that sometimes giving people certain results can change their test scores. So if you give people something that's upsetting and it makes them think that they're not thinking very well. So for example, if you gave somebody a positive amyloid scan, that might make their cognitive tests worse. And so this was a study that showing people that they had a higher genetic risk actually made their cognitive test scores worse. And so simultaneously telling people their results also changed the results of the scientific study. So that's another complication. So what we're trying to do is balance a bunch of things. So we really want to give everybody the results that they want. We want to be able to communicate them clearly, and so our primary thing is to give the participants what they want and to not hurt participants. So we don't want to if it turns out that giving really upsetting results is more harm than good, then that will be a problem as well. So we want to return results, we don't want to harm people, and then also we want to maintain the scientific integrity of our studies. So we want to make sure that that we're not dramatically changing the results of the studies by giving results. So this is why things are moving slowly, because it's actually complicated, even though it seems like it should be simple. So what we did this past year is we recruited 20 participants who had had an MRI recently, and they were normal MRIs. So I'm not sure if you're aware that you would get a phone call sometime after your MRI if there was something seen on the MRI that was a clinical issue that would be relevant to your health care. So all 20 participants were considered normal MRIs. So a normal MRI can have a few, there are some things that are normal that would be noted on an MRI report, but mostly the MRI report just reads normal. So the participants came in, they knew their MRIs were normal, they were shown the MRI on the computer, and they were given a radiology report and pictures of their brain. So they got to see, I mean, the neat thing was they got to see their brain kind of, online and in 3 dimensions. And then we called them 2 weeks later to talk about their experience. So the preliminary results, the first thing was that in general, people were enthusiastic about participating. So we approached 25 participants. We returned 20 MRIs, and of the 25, only 2 were not interested. The three others had scheduling conflicts. So, and what we learned logistically is that the most important thing is communication, communicating clearly what you can and can't see on an MRI. Specifically, an MRI, these MRI results don't tell you anything about your risk of Alzheimer's disease. And so that was tricky to communicate. And so we needed to make sure that we were saying this up front, because a lot of people ended up coming in thinking that they were going to get some sort of risk information when this was not the case. So first of all, the most important thing is to communicate very clearly and make sure that everybody is on the same page. And the second thing is that it's important to do this in a separate appointment when you can take however much time the participant wants to talk or not talk. That it can be very fast or it can be slower, and whatever works is good, but it shouldn't be up against a time pressure, and it needs to be done kind of separately from the other components of the MAP study. So some excerpts from our follow-up interviews are kind of interesting. So the first one, I thought it went really well. However, after seeing it and thinking about it later on, I wondered if it had not come out that it was like normal, a normal aging brain. If there was something seriously wrong, I wonder how I would have reacted, and maybe I wouldn't have wanted to know that. So this person is kind of questioning whether they would have wanted to participate if there had been something abnormal in the MRI. But the next person said, I received no information whatsoever to indicate whether I would develop Alzheimer's. There's nothing in the brain MRI that gives you any information on that. That's what I'm most interested in. So this person wanted more specific risks. So the first person was particularly concerned about how he or she would react to results if they showed an increased risk for Alzheimer's, and the second person wanted more details about their risk of Alzheimer's. So these I see as kind of contradictory, which is where communicating with the participants ahead of time to make sure that we're clear on what they do and don't want is extremely important. So another thing we've done to move forward is we set up a return of results advisory committee that we formed in February 2018. We selected 5 participants to advise us on issues regarding return results. And we selected participants based on what we knew about their backgrounds, so that they were varied backgrounds and also and varied opinions, whether or not people wanted results. I don't know if any of the members of the committee are here, but if you are here, would you please stand? Oh, good. Thank you. So what we're doing is we're working closely with the committee to try to move forward so that we can give results that are helpful, safe, and scientifically don't hurt our studies. So thank you for your patience.
So you have those index cards, and you have questions, you write them down. Now, Dr. Hartz has to leave So she won't be on the panel. It's not because she's afraid of what you're writing down on those index cards, but we'll have other people handle the questions that you may have. So our next speaker is Suzanne Schindler. She's a neurologist, and she's been working on blood tests for Alzheimer's disease. Let's welcome Dr. Schindler.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to get to talk with all of you today. Well, I wanted to start off by just asking if anyone would like maybe to have a blood test for Alzheimer's. Would you be interested in something like that? Yeah, well, I'll tell you that all of us clinicians are too, and we've actually made some progress on this over the last year. So I'm going to tell you about this. I should note that this is really the work of Dr. Randall Bateman, and he would have very much liked to have been here to give this presentation himself, but today happens to be his son's graduation from high school. So, priorities, you know. So, I have been involved with some of the data analysis, so I'm familiar with what was done, but this is really Dr. Bateman's work. So when you're doing a test for something, first of all, you have to know what it is that you're testing for. As Dr. Morris talked about, Alzheimer's disease is a brain disease, and the way it's characterized is by these microscopic brain changes. And I have a slide. If you look at this red dot up here, this is actually part of someone's brain who passed away from Alzheimer's disease. And they have some stuff in there that shouldn't be there. So there's this amyloid plaque. This is kind of what it looks like. And it's made out of a protein called beta amyloid. We shorten that to A-beta. And there are also these structures called neurofibrillary tangles, and they're mostly made out of a protein called tau. And as Dr. Morris mentioned, you start developing these changes, these plaques and tangles, many years, decades before the onset of any symptoms. The testing that we have for Alzheimer's disease is really to see whether you have these plaques and tangles in your brain. And so two of the techniques that you guys are probably very familiar with is amyloid PET. Probably a lot of you have had amyloid PET scans. The way this works is we have chemicals that actually bind to these amyloid plaques. And then you get a PET scan, and if you have a lot of amyloid plaques, your brain lights up. So on the left here is somebody's brain who has Alzheimer's disease. On the right is someone who does not. One caveat, a lot of this is not so straightforward, so I'm showing you an extreme example, but sometimes it's kind of fuzzy. Now, another test we have that's pretty good for predicting whether you have amyloid plaques in your brain is looking at the cerebral spinal fluid. And thank you very much for all of your contributions. We've actually learned a lot from looking at your cerebral spinal fluid. So the cerebral spinal fluid is made by your brain, surrounds your brain and spinal cord. We take a little bit out of it, and we can measure levels of this same protein that's part of these plaques and these tangles, and the levels are altered if you have a lot of these. Again, these tests aren't perfect, but they're relatively good at telling us whether you're likely to have a lot of plaques and tangles. Now, is there currently a blood test for Alzheimer's disease? Well, no. And a lot of people have been working hard on this for a while, so it's not like we haven't been trying, but really nothing has worked well so far. Now, there's a lot of advantages to doing a blood test. Probably pretty easy for you guys to consider. It could potentially be cheaper, and obviously it's a lot easier to get your blood drawn than to have to go in for a lumbar puncture and the amyloid PET. However, we haven't been able to make it work, and it's possible that a blood test will never be as good as amyloid PET brain imaging or CSF testing because the blood is separate. And there's a lot of stuff in blood that can interfere with the test. And that's in contrast to CSF, which is actually made by the brain in contact with the brain, and amyloid PET imaging, where you're taking a picture of the brain. So it may not be possible to have a perfect test with blood, but we're still trying. And even if we come up with a good test, not a perfect test, but a reasonable test, that could actually be very helpful primarily for screening. So when doctors talk about screening, what that means is you do a test, and if it's positive, that's concerning, and then you do another test that's confirmatory. So for example, you could do a blood test, and if that's positive, then you do an amyloid PET scan or CSF testing. So Dr. Bateman's lab has been very interested in looking at the amyloid or A-beta in the blood to see if maybe this could be a blood test. Again, amyloid beta is made in the brain, by the brain. It's normal. We all have A-beta. And it's the major component of these amyloid plaques, and it's thought to kick off this whole process that leads to Alzheimer's disease dementia. Now, it's also found in the cerebral spinal fluid. It's one of the major things we measure when we look at your cerebral spinal fluid. And it turns out there's a teeny tiny bit of it in your blood. Now, there are two major forms or lengths of A-beta. There's a shorter length that we call A-beta 40 and a longer length that we call A-beta 42. They have slightly different properties. And the Bateman lab has developed a technique to very, very precisely measure these two forms of A-beta. And a lot of people have measured this before, but because the levels are so low and the tests weren't as good, they couldn't see a clear difference. But Dr. Bateman has used a technique called mass spectrometry to really improve this measurement. And what his lab has found, and I'll show you some data on this, is that the ratio of A-beta 42 to 40 is lower in people who have a lot of plaques in their brain, as shown by amyloid PET. So this is some data that was published in July. So these blue dots on the left here are blood samples from people who had an amyloid PET scan that was negative, so they don't have a lot of amyloid in their brain. And these red triangles on the right here are from 18 people who had a positive amyloid PET scan that indicated they had quite a few of these amyloid plaques. Now, if you look at this ratio of A-beta 42 to 40, what you see is that the people who were negative had a higher ratio than the people who were positive. Now, this is not a perfect test. If this were a perfect test, you could draw a line to perfectly separate these two groups. You can't do that, but it turns out there's a significant difference between the groups. And this is actually beautiful data. This is really a lot better than the results from previous blood tests. So this is very promising. Now, I'm a scientist, and scientists are a little skeptical. And so when we look at data like this, we're like, well, maybe they got lucky. Maybe this is a fluke. Maybe if they do this again, it'll be the same between the two groups. So Dr. Bateman, using blood samples from 164 of you, measured this blood A-beta 42 to 40, and based on whether you were amyloid PET negative or PET positive, so same kind of strategy. And what you see is 101 of you who had a negative amyloid PET scan also had a higher ratio for this blood measure, so A-beta 42 over 40. And if you were amyloid PET positive, which 63 folks were, the value was lower. So again, we're seeing a significant difference between groups. Again, I would point out it's not a perfect test. There's a lot of false negatives and false positives. However, this is quite a bit better than what we typically see with any blood test that's been developed for Alzheimer's. Now, something that was really quite fortuitous is that it turns out there was another group who at the same time as Dr. Bateman was working on this same idea in Japan, and they got the same result using samples from people in Japan and in Australia. So they had the same findings, so that this ratio was 42 to 40 was higher in people who had a negative PET scan than people who had a positive PET scan. So what does this mean? This means that it may be possible to develop a blood test for Alzheimer's disease based on these measurements of amyloid. It's not going to be a perfect test, though, and so we have to think carefully about how to use it. But all of this data together that's showing the same thing from different groups, different types of, different countries, this really suggests that this is real, that there's a lot of hope and promise here. So what's next? So the Bateman Lab has been working very hard over the last 9 months or so to try and perfect this blood test. This is not an easy thing to do. If it were easy, it would have been done a long time ago. The differences between the levels is quite small, and so that means you have to make extremely precise measurements. It's also difficult to get exactly the same results each time, and so I've been working on developing this so you get reproducible results. Now, very soon, over the next few months, they're going to be running more blood samples that were collected from you to learn more about this blood test and how to interpret it. For example, we suspect that age might reflect or affect the results, and we're also interested in seeing how the ratio changes over time within the same individual. The Bateman Lab has also applied for a grant to test blood samples from about 8,000 people to see if this can be used on a larger scale as a screening test. If this works, this would be a really big deal. And why would this be a big deal? I just told you it's not a perfect test. It's not great. Well, we really want to find a cure or preventative medication for Alzheimer's. And right now, we're doing these prevention trials where we have to find people who have some evidence of plaques and tangles in their brain. So everyone that we want to screen for, we have to do the amyloid PET, the CSF biomarkers. This is expensive. It takes a long time. It would be so much easier if we had a screening test. And then we just did a blood test, and then we picked out the people that were positive, and then we did a confirmatory test on them. This would save an incredible amount of time and money and could really speed up the progress of these trials. So that's why we're really excited about this. Now, thinking about this in the long term, really what we'd like to do is that someday when we have these drugs that prevent Alzheimer's disease, that you go in for your annual doctor's visit, and they draw some blood and they check your cholesterol, they check for diabetes, and if you're positive, then they have medications to treat you with. Well, hopefully someday we'll be able to do that for Alzheimer's disease. And along with your statin and metformin or whatever, if you need it, you'll get a drug that will prevent you from ever developing the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So I want to thank all of you who have contributed to this. I mean, none of this research could have been done without those of you willing to do these amyloid PET scans and CSF studies and blood tests as well. We can't do any of this research without you. There's quite a few people in the lab that have been working on this as well. I've had a little bit of a role, but Randy Bateman has led the team. And there's quite a few scientists and technicians and nurse coordinators who've been involved as well. So Jim Bollinger, Terry Hicks, Quasi Menewega, Vitaly Ovid, Teresa Schneider, and Melissa Sullivan. So thank you very much.
So thanks so much, Suzanne. One of the things that we don't emphasize enough is that the Knight ADRC is very committed to developing the next generation of Alzheimer's disease researchers, and I mentioned Dr. Greg Day, who is with us and is looking at early onset Alzheimer's disease, and Suzanne Schindler are some of our brightest early stage investigators who have very promising careers. You may have noticed that Dr. Schindler herself is working on the next generation of Alzheimer people. She's expecting her second child in August. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you now Dr. Daniel Blash, who's Assistant Dean of Cultural Awareness and Staff Diversity at the School of Medicine. And he's going to discuss about diversity and inclusion. Daniel, let's welcome him. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Well, greetings to you all. I'm here, and it's a very busy day, but I can tell you that there's nothing that I'll do this day that will be any more rewarding than being here with you. And I mean that. I'm here for 3 reasons. First, the top of the list, Dr. Morris told me to be here. Second, I own and operate one of the largest privately owned mental health agencies in the inner city of St. Louis. And Alzheimer's and issues of dementia of the brain are very important to me personally because of a family connection. So what we focus on downtown when we're working with people with dementia or Alzheimer's or any sort of issue of that nature is we're really focused on their family members. We think about some of those other issues. And so it's very important. We need the work that the scientists are doing. We need the work that everyone here is doing. But we want to also focus practically on the family members and the stress that group carries to be primary caregivers often or watching someone deteriorate. On a personal note, and this would be the third reason, my stepdad passed away about 4 years ago from complications of dementia, Alzheimer's, and as he was in his final stages, he could barely recognize me, and I've heard a little humor in the room today, and so we had a little humor with it. I have an uncle, and we look a lot alike. So my stepdad would call us by each other's name. So we would let that happen. That way, we both took credit for the visit. So we just kind of went with that. My job at the School of Medicine is to be a mirror and a reflection. There are 108 nationalities at the School of Medicine. That's just in terms of that sort of diversity, but lots of other issues that bring us to discussing diversity and inclusion. The more we understand on our campus, the more we can contribute and partner with groups like this. And so I want to walk you very quickly through some of the things that are happening at the School of Medicine and how it relates to this work. So this is an image of our campus, which is ever expanding. And I don't know that this even captures all of it. If you've tried to drive on our campus, you understand what I'm talking about. But we have partnerships with, of course, Barnes-Jewish. We have partnerships with the hospital, and even in terms of the School of Pharmacy and the School of Nursing, which aren't listed, those are looser. But we also have partnerships with those folks. As it relates to the School of Medicine and thinking about diversity, and inclusion, there was lots of work that happened prior to 2000, but this chart starts at 2000, and around that time, some of our trainees began to bring issues to our attention, to the attention of senior faculty members, just about their experience. These are people who ultimately would be physicians and will be treating lots of different folks, and they wanted their learning to reflect that. There were many other reasons, and so you can see sort of a progression of activities around diversity and inclusion. If I can fast forward to 2013, that's a very important year because that's the year they hired me. And it's only important for me, but that's important. And so for the first time in the history of the School of Medicine, they brought 2 people on to think about this full time, to work with our departments and our various groups to try and assist them along the way. In 2014, we did a diversity engagement survey, and we learned quite a bit about our campus. One of the things that might be of interest to this group is we learned that the older a person is on our campus, the less positively they rated their experience on our campus. So we began to think about those sorts of issues. I bring that up because when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and particularly when we talk about diversity and inclusion in St. Louis, the issue is really in most people's mind black and white. But everyone in this room realizes that it's way beyond black and white, and that's how we treat our work. One of the most promising things that happened as it relates to this chart is in 2015. In 2015, our executive faculty, which make up all the department heads of the School of Medicine as well as the program heads, decided to give away their annual retreat to think about and talk about diversity and inclusion. We invited Howard Ross, who is a national guru around bias, and Howard and I talked before that meeting, and he said, I want to speak to this group on science, the science of unconscious bias. I said, Howard, don't do it. They're all scientists, and it won't go well. And I couldn't convince him not to do it, but I did convince him to take the word science out of the presentation. But he came and he spoke for a half day. Now, Howard describes himself, his words, not mine. He says, I'm basically a hippie. He's, I don't know, he's 62 or 3. He's just casual, happy-go-lucky, and I knew he would be talking to scientists. And after half a day, he stopped and said, are there any questions about the science of unconscious bias? And there were, I know, right? I just thought, oh my, there were no questions except for one, what do we do about this? How do we work in a way that best reflects the environment in which we live and work? And I just wanted to stand up and applaud. I was amazed at our senior leaders and how they responded. From that, and I will move very quickly through this slide because it's not germane to most of what I want to say, but from that, there were 5 areas that those senior leaders thought we should probably begin to focus on. These 5 areas touch all 3 of the main goals of the School of Medicine, the education component, the research component, and the clinical care component. And that was amazing. At this point, we've concluded 3 of the 5, and we're continuing to work on it. But what really happened that was amazing is our then dean, Larry Shapiro, developed a committee, and this committee consisted of at least 6 department heads. It's many other people on this list, but 6 of them are department heads, including the department head of orthopedic surgery, our dean, the department head of internal medicine, which is our largest department, makes up about 1/4 of the School of Medicine. One of my bosses, department head of psychiatry, and many senior leaders, and this represented one of the first groups nationally to come together with this many senior leaders to think about diversity and inclusion. I was incredibly impressed and still am. So my team and I then were given a mission, and that was to talk to the entire School of Medicine about diversity and inclusion. Our team was mandated to speak to everyone. The School of Medicine has somewhere around 14,000 people, that maybe a little bit more, on the campus, and those are just the people who are employed there. We were mandated to speak to all of them for a total of 4 hours. We developed 4 iterations of diversity inclusion training, one about awareness, one about commitment, where we introduce issues of unconscious bias, one around action, understanding, and then one around action. And so briefly, you can see sort of what people learned as they went through the 1.0, the 2.0, the 3.0, and the 4.0. In the very first one, they learned about awareness, and we told them who was on our campus and why it mattered that we did business in a way that worked for all the people on our campus. And again, across as many dimensions as possible, those who don't ambulate well, and so maybe they need wheelchair access, those who are older, those who are the younger employees, those who are people of color. We talked about all those issues and awareness. People were shocked when I said there are 108 nationalities on our campus, and that our campus is 67% female. That our campus has 3 department heads that have been female over the last 160 years. Those sorts of stats people just didn't know, and they responded in many different ways to those statistics. We wanted there to be basic awareness. But then we also wanted to talk about the unconscious bias, the fact that we all have preferences, and how does that show up in what we do and how we interact with people. All of these were very interactive because, well, I hate boring. And very well received. 3.0, we talked about commitment. What do you do, and how do you really change your environment? How do you speak up, and what actions do you take to really make a difference so that everyone is included in what you're doing? As Dr. Morris talked about, when it relates to research, it's critical. If we're only studying one group, then that's a problem. I want to pause there and go back to the story of my stepdad. He was very skeptical and would not come to participate in research. And this is why. By the time he began to have memory loss, his suspicion and his skepticism, his insecurities were off the chart high. And he was very unwilling to go into a clinic where everyone was white, where all the researchers were white, where all the clinicians were white, and to trust that he would be well taken care of. Research was terrifying to him. Unfortunately, because of that, he did not participate. And his quality of life toward the end wasn't what it could be. And my mother, who was his caregiver, I think her stress level was higher than it had to be. If I can do anything to help that next person out there find a bridge between where they are and what's happening here, I think that's a worthwhile goal. And so that's another reason for being here. And then finally, in terms of what we taught the school is we need to do something. It's not important. It's important to know, but it's really important to do. At the end of the day, we have to follow through and actually make some changes and move the needle, so to speak, so that we're not just talking about a more inclusive place, but really are a more inclusive place. And that's important. As it relates to the Knight ADRC, this group was what we call early adopters. Dr. Morris, his team, just gravitated instantly and said, you're a resource for us, then we're going to use you because we need help. We need to do, first of all, they do fantastic work, but can we do it better? And if so, is there training, and can you train us? And so we did that. We trained them on all of the 1, 2, 3, 4.0, and everyone participated and was very engaged. And what I love about this group is they wanted to make what they were learning connect to what they were actually doing, so the information was germane to their real work. And so we went through all of that, and then they asked for more. So I think I've worked with one of the boards. I think I've worked with some of the volunteers, and it's been amazing. So I came back and gave them a school-wide update. I also came back and talked to them about the diversity engagement survey and what that meant. I believe that all employee groups at this point in the Knight ADRC have been trained. I believe that's true for probably all the volunteers, and not every group on campus is that way. As a matter of fact, I would say there's some of the leaders in terms of who's doing the work on campus, and that's worth applauding. Thanks for your time, and thanks for the invitation. Again, this is the most rewarding thing I will do all day today. Thank you.
So now we're going to have Dr. Joy Snyder talk to us about trials of medications. Dr. Snyder, like Dr. Schindler, is a clinician in the Memory and Aging Project. We have other clinicians who you may recognize. I mentioned Dr. Day's name, but Greg, will you stand up if you're there? Dr. Greg Day. Dr. Renata Reimers. Renata, where are you? Renata is waving her hand. And Dr. Lenice Cummings-Vaughn. Lenice, where are you? Right here. So let's welcome Dr. Snyder and learn about progress on drugs.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm the last thing between you and questions and then getting out of here, so I will try to move pretty quickly. And feel if I'm going too fast, somebody hold up the stop sign for me. I've had a lot of coffee, and I tend to talk a little quickly. So you've heard a lot this morning about the end game. I think Dr. Schindler put it well. We want a world without Alzheimer's, so we need some treatments to stop that disease. And we've been trying for years. People around the world have been trying, and just that's summarized on the slide here. So in the 10 years between 2002 and 2012, 244 drugs were tested in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, and only one of them worked, and it didn't work all that well. It's a drug called Namenda or memantine, which has been approved by the FDA, but as many of you may know who have loved ones on these medications, they don't stop the disease. They at best slow it down a little bit. So, you know, what's going on here? I think this is a headline from just actually a couple of last month. These trials keep failing. They keep failing, but that's pretty amazing because when they fail, we learn things. So we do learn a lot from failed trials, and there are sort of two ways to look at this. And many of you have a water glass on your table, so it may be half full or half empty, depending on your perspective. And these two fish illustrate that. The one with its head in the water thinks things are just fine, and the one out of the water says this is definitely half empty. I fall on the half full side. Hopefully most of you do. But we do learn from these failed trials, but sometimes it is discouraging. So you've heard a lot about this slide today, and I won't belabor the point, but this is one of those amyloid scans. You saw a picture, I think, from Dr. Schindler, and Dr. Boris mentioned it as well. People who are cognitively normal and don't have any amyloid in their brains have a scan like the one, gotta get my directions right, on the left. Oh, I can use that. Okay, this one, yeah, ooh, big red dot. So that's a cognitively normal person who doesn't have any buildup of amyloid on this amyloid imaging scan, a PET scan, and the person on the right does have a lot of it light up. Now, your brain really doesn't glow red like that. That's what they do with the computer, but you do get more signal when you have amyloid in the brain. And this is a control person over here and a person with Alzheimer's over here, so that all makes perfect sense. But then there are these other people who are perfectly normal. They've been through all the testing that we do, so we know they're normal, and yet their brain looks pretty much just like the amyloid positive one. And this particular person began to develop symptoms of Alzheimer's 3 years after that scan. As Dr. Schindler mentioned, this is still research, so we don't know that everybody with a positive scan will develop Alzheimer's within 3 years. We know they're at higher risk. So we've used this type of scanning in clinical trials for a couple of purposes. One is to make sure the people in the trial have Alzheimer's if they have symptoms, not caused by something else. And the other way is to identify those people who have the amyloid changes 5, 10, 20 years before they get Alzheimer's in order to prevent the disease. So there's two major types of trials we're doing now. One type is to prevent the disease in people with no symptoms, and the other type is to treat the disease in people who have symptoms. So those are the two types of studies I'm going to talk about. And the very first trial to prevent the disease actually isn't listed here. That was the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's unit treatment trial, but that's a very small group of people who have the genetic form of the disease that strikes when you're young. In the vast majority of people, the disease strikes, as Dr. Boris mentioned, when you're well over 70, I think we have to say now, and is a disease of older adults. So the first study in that group was called the A4 study. And some committee came up with this, I'm sure, anti-amyloid treatment in asymptomatic Alzheimer's. So there's 4 A's in there. And this study started several years ago. Participants had to be perfectly normal. We started it at the Knight ADRC in October of 2014. They had to be perfectly normal, and then they got this PET scan. And you heard about that, I think, from Dr. Hartz as well. People got the results of that PET scan, were told if it showed amyloid or not. So we were one of 68 sites in the United States. We screened 74 people. Only 15 of them ended up being in the trial because most people had a negative PET scan. That study is now closed to enrollment. They've enrolled 1,100 people to either get treatment or to get the placebo. And when this study was first launched, they told the leader of the study, Dr. Sperling from Harvard, that she'd never get enough people in this study, and so she's quite happy that she got enough people, the study's closed, and now it's running. Because since we know it takes several years for these people to get Alzheimer's, we have to treat for several years so that the few people in the study may or may not develop Alzheimer's. So results aren't expected till 2022, which used to seem like a long time, but now it's only 4 years from now. One thing that happened in this study in the last year or two is because of results from studies in people with symptoms, they decided to increase the dose of the medication. So people are on a higher dose than they started with, and that's another reason it's taking a little bit longer. But so we are getting closer to when we know if this particular drug will work to prevent Alzheimer's disease. Another study was started somewhat later after that one to test a different drug. The drug in the A4 study is an IV drug. You have to come in once a month and get an intravenous infusion of the drug. In the next study that was started, the early study, it was a drug by mouth. So that was thought to be much easier. We were planning to be a study site, but had not yet enrolled any participants. And just last month, this study was halted because people were developing liver problems with this medication, and it was thought that the risk was too high to continue using this medication in people without any symptoms, the majority of whom wouldn't develop symptoms. Another study is being developed now in the planning phases that may use 2 different drugs to prevent Alzheimer's, so this type of study is ongoing. And the reason to tell you about that, we're not recruiting for any of these right now, but it's because what you did, all those amyloid PET scans and spinal taps and memory testing and assessments you've done over the last 20, 30 years are the reason we could do these studies, the reason they were available nationally. So this group here, as Dr. Morris said, has really contributed disproportionately, more than anybody else in the country, to being able to do these types of studies. So you guys made it possible, and I think that's amazing. I'm supposed to hurry up. Okay. So I noticed that Dr. Morris went over his time. I hope I have a job next year, I can tell you that. So what about symptoms for people with treatments? So one study was a study called Navigate AD, and it was testing a by-mouth agent. 1,000 people were enrolled worldwide. These were people with mild memory symptoms, included that same PET scan. Unfortunately, this study was stopped recently, actually just a month or two ago, because when they did the analysis midway through, it wasn't showing any benefit. So they went ahead and stopped that study. One study that is still ongoing is a study called Engage or Emerge. There are 2 studies that are the same. This is another one of those antibodies. It's called aducanumab, kind of rolls off your tongue. The goal is 1,600 people worldwide. As of May 15th, last time I checked, there were 1,522 enrolled. So we're not screening anyone else. We do have 1 person still in screening here. We have 9 people randomized at our ADRC and 1 more still in screening. So that study will go on for the next several years. They're getting the drug or placebo. And the primary endpoint, I just wanted to point out, is something called the CDR sum of boxes, which was developed right here at WashU at our ADRC. So again, that's a way you've contributed to helping develop that scale. And again, 2022 is the magic year for that study. One more study for people with symptoms is called Trailblazer. It's a very interesting study because it's using 2 drugs, 1 IV drug and 1 by mouth drug. So it's the first study to use 2 drugs in combination. One of them blocks the creation of beta amyloid, and one of them increases the clearance of beta amyloid. So it's striking at that in 2 ways. The goal is 1,500 folks worldwide. It began early in 2018, and as of yesterday, we got our IRB approval, start recruiting for it soon. We have a perfect pool of people to recruit for this because the folks that were in that Navigate study that closed are all many are probably eligible for this study. So we're going to ask them to roll into this study, which should make our recruitment very easy. We're hoping to begin recruitment for this in the next couple of weeks. So why are we excited about that? Why are we still, after all these years of doing studies that didn't work, why do we still get up in the morning and come to work? And the reason is, we may be crazy, but secondarily, these drugs are very promising, and we know they're promising based on what we've learned from the last 20 years of studies. So, for example, this drug called aducanumab was the very first one that showed that if we reduce the amyloid in the brain, as measured by those PET scans, that we actually have an impact on thinking. So this is a positive PET scan, and what they did in this study is they looked at the people whose PET scan got better, and compared it to the people whose PET scan didn't get better. So these are the folks whose PET scan got better by 1 standard deviation. Well, these are the people whose PET scan got better by 1 standard deviation. These folks didn't. And if you look at this particular, this is the CDR sum of boxes. So these people's thinking got worse. Their CDR sum of boxes went up, and these people didn't. So the folks whose amyloid got better, memory didn't get worse. So we stopped progression of the disease. So that's very exciting. That's a phase 2 result. Not in very many people. As Dr. Schindler said, we're kind of skeptical as scientists. We want to see it in more people. That's what the phase 3 study is doing. And the other drug I told you about, the one that's in the Trailblazer study, they show, they didn't have this cognitive endpoint because it was a small preliminary study, but they showed they could get this amyloid level back to normal in people that had a positive scan and were treated with this medication. So that's pretty exciting. So that's why we're excited. So the future, there are 252 active intervention trials if you search on clinicaltrials.gov. About 50 of these are using medicines. Some of them are using other things, diet, exercise, yoga, anything you can think of. But the emphasis in all of them is on biomarkers, things like the spinal fluid, the PET scans, because we can enroll normal people who we know will get Alzheimer's, and if we enroll people with symptoms, we know they have Alzheimer's. So at the Knight ADRC, as Dr. Morris mentioned, we have the world's best participants right here. We have the world's best staff, and that is fantastic, and that's why we all love working here. But that's not enough. We need to do more. So we are working on getting support and hiring more staff so we can do more clinical trials. We are working on bringing in more participants. We need more folks in our studies, as Dr. Morris mentioned. We need more folks to come every year for the studies, and we need more people for clinical trials. So tell your friends, tell your neighbors, recruit your family. Most of us have done that because that's the future of Alzheimer's research, because that tsunami is coming, and we do want to prevent it. So the bottom line, there have been a lot of trials, no treatment yet, but we've learned a lot, and we're hoping that these new trials can tell us how to prevent or slow down Alzheimer's. And really, you made this possible. So this is because of your work over the last years that we're able to do this now, and hopefully someday do have that world without Alzheimer's. So I'll stop there.
Joy, thanks very much. That was great. Of course, this will be your last presentation. I wonder if Dr. Blash and Dr. Schindler can join me at the podium. Staff will circulate, get your index cards, and bring them up to the podium. We won't be able to address them all. We'll do our best.
Should I just leave now? Hi, good to see you.
You have a preference?
Yeah, you're the boss.
Yeah.
David, let me have some to get going, or one to get going. Oh, you! Terrific. Thank you so much. You got your pin. That's great. That's terrific. Oh, that's terrific.
Following you.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Schindler, question here, is there a different way to do the spinal tap? You know, people poke you in the back and they feel around. Why is that? Is there a different way to do it?
I don't think so. I actually think the way we do it is, so I do quite a few spinal taps, so does Dr. Snyder. It's actually relatively simple in terms of, for us, it's maybe a little bit more involved than a blood draw because we have to feel the bones in your back, but it's not that complicated. There's actually a fancy way to do it with x-rays, but we don't typically need to do it that way. So, sorry. I don't think there's a better way to do it.
Okay, Dr. Snyder and drugs. So say somebody gets on an approved drug, an Alzheimer patient gets on an approved drug for Alzheimer's disease, Aricept or Exelon or Namenda. Should they take it all the way till death?
That's a great question, and it's something we struggle with in the clinic. So what we try to do with those drugs, and when you see your doctor, whoever's treating you or your loved one, it's an item of discussion, is you want to use the medications as long as their benefit outweighs the side effects. And so certainly there may be a point when that's no longer the case. For drugs like Aricept and Exelon and Razidine, those drugs can damp down your appetite a little bit. So if somebody gets to the point where they're not eating well, that's a time to stop those drugs because they may be doing more harm than good. But, we tend to use them throughout the course of the disease until we think there's really no more chance of benefit.
Okay, I'm going to try this one. If your scan is amyloid PET positive, does that indicate that you'll develop memory loss, you'll develop dementia? We don't know. So remember that your brain can be developing the plaques and tangles 20 or 25 years before it produces memory loss. Amyloid PET scan began in 2004. So we've been studying people for 14 years, but say we got them when they were 20 years before we expect them to develop memory loss. We haven't followed enough people long enough to know if you have an amyloid PET scan, that means inevitably you're going to get the disease or not, and we don't know when. So it's still a process of understanding. Now, this is good. Okay, Joy, back to different drugs that we have available to us. Is there a patch, and is it effective?
Yes, so the patch that's available is a drug called Exelon or rivastigmine, and it's the same drug that's available by mouth by the same name and works very similarly to Aricept and Razidine, or donepezil and galantamine are the generic names. And it's about as effective as the oral medication, so it slows down the symptom progression a little bit. Doesn't change the underlying brain disease. So it's very similar. When it first came out, the front page of the Belleville News-Democrat trumpeted new Alzheimer's cure, and it's not that, but it is about as effective as the other oral medications.
And as long as you're talking about drugs, what are the side effects of Namenda and of the Razidine and galantamine and Exelon and Aricept? What are the side effects?
So the main side effects of the drugs that are in the class of Aricept, galantamine, and Exelon are stomach upset. So people can get nausea, vomiting, stop eating. Most people do fine, but some people do get those side effects. Some people get dizzy when they stand up. I think Dr. Morris may remember when we were doing one of the clinical trials of, I think, Aricept, we had a patient who got a broken arm because they stood up and passed out. And so that was a side effect of the drug. That's rare, but it does happen. And the other strange things with those drugs is they can give you really weird dreams, very vivid nightmares. And so some people don't take them for that reason. Although I had one patient who liked it and kept taking it. For Namenda or memantine, that particular drug, the biggest side effect is constipation. So that's a big deal. And then occasionally on that drug, some people will actually get a little more confused. So that's a very small subset, but that's something we look out for.
Okay, I'm going to try to knock off a few of these. What happened to our study where a few years ago we were trying to diagnose Alzheimer's disease by an eye exam? Some of you remember that? Sure. We were looking for amyloid deposits in the eye. You know, the eye is really an extension of the brain, so we thought if we could just do an eye exam and see the amyloid, that would tell us. It did not. Did not. Second, what about the idea of cognitive reserve? So, how many of you have heard that playing Sudoku or bridge or something like that will protect us against Alzheimer's disease? Have people heard about that? The brain is a muscle. Let's exercise it. It'll get stronger. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. Matter of fact, if you take a group of people 75 and older and you look at the people who are involved in those activities of really, stressing the brain, staying mentally active, physically active, socially engaged, those people are less likely to have Alzheimer's than the group of people who don't do those things. But cause or effect, Maybe the people who play bridge or do Sudoku were born with a bigger, better brain. And the bridge is a reflection of that better brain. It's not that the bridge made it better. Does that make sense? So we don't know the answer. It won't hurt to stay mentally active or physically active or socially engaged. Do it. But to my knowledge, there's only one mental activity that we know for certain will prevent Alzheimer's disease. And that's attending the Knight ADRC participants breakfast. Dr. Snyder, is brain donation still a valuable thing for the Knight ADRC?
Yes, brain donation is one of the biggest gifts you and your family can give, and it helps us learn more about Alzheimer's disease, particularly because your brains, I hate to be biased, but are more valuable than anybody else's because we've got all this information on you. We know your cognitive status, we know about the amyloid and the brain and the spinal fluid, and so being able to compare what we've seen during life to what that brain looks like is an amazing gift. So we really appreciate it and encourage folks to think about doing that.
Dr. Blash, it's been said that African Americans and maybe Native Americans and maybe Hispanics are more at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease than are whites. Is that true?
It's an excellent question. It's just directed at the wrong person.
So
I don't know, but that's
and I think that's the right answer. There are studies to suggest that, but in fact, there haven't been enough studies and enough individuals to know that. So there seems to be greater risk of Alzheimer's disease in African Americans and Hispanics and Native Americans and in whites. How many of you have heard reports of Alzheimer's disease in Native Americans? No one has. It's thought to be. It hasn't been sufficiently studied. Does that make sense? That's why we need to study all people. Okay, Dr. Schindler, what's the connection between Alzheimer's disease and sleep?
Well, we're learning more and more about this, and actually Dr. Holtzman, who's the chair of neurology, is really one of the world experts on this topic. But it appears that sleep is good. So I'll encourage all of you to sleep well tonight and make enough time for sleep. But we think that poor sleep may make problems with memory and thinking worse. And we think memory and thinking problems may make sleep worse. So we think it's a kind of bidirectional sort of thing. And so we certainly recommend that if you're having problems with your sleep, that you have those evaluated because they may play into memory and thinking issues.
So just to build on what Dr. Schindler reported is what Dr. Holtzman has been able to do, not in people per se, but in animal models of Alzheimer's disease. When the animals sleep, they produce less amyloid than when they're awake. So it may be not just a facet of whether they get a good rest. It may be a biologic problem with sleep. Okay, I'll try this one. Does Alzheimer's disease occur more in any nationality? For example, do Italians more likely to get it than Japanese people? Again, it's possible. I don't really think so. I think the biggest factor is how much of a particular nationality or a community is older. So developed countries, Japan is the leading example, have more older people than other countries, and they have more Alzheimer's. But if you think about developing countries, India and China, proportionately, they have much fewer Alzheimer cases than does Japan because they have many fewer, proportionally, older people, but they're becoming developed. And you can imagine the silver tsunami when those developing countries start having aging populations themselves. Okay, Joy, try this one, because this comes up often in our clinical practice. Can statin drugs cause memory problems?
So there's been a lot of press and a lot on the internet. If you ask Dr. Google, you can learn a lot about statin drugs. These are the drugs used to treat people with high cholesterol. So we know these drugs are effective in reducing cholesterol, reducing your risk of heart attack and stroke, so they're very important for that. But they do have side effects, and some people do think that they cause memory problems. The data on that is pretty slim. So it's, you know, there are rare cases where people develop pretty severe memory problems, but that's extremely rare. And in the vast majority of cases, people who are on a statin are on it for a good reason, to prevent heart attack and stroke, both of which increase your risk of Alzheimer's disease. And so they should really not get off the statin just because they think it might affect their memory, because in 99% of people it does not affect your memory.
Okay, Dr. Schindler, what would you suggest about, I mentioned mental activity, physical activity, social engagement. What about diet?
Well, in general, I think that a heart-healthy diet is a brain-healthy diet. Both your heart and your brain require a lot of blood supply, and we know that foods that increase your vascular risk are bad for you. So we recommend that you eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, and fish is good, nuts are good, things like that. There is not one diet or magic pill kind of thing that's protective against Alzheimer's disease, but certainly we think that taking good care of yourself and a healthy diet is good for you overall.
How many of you have heard that red wine might protect against Alzheimer's? Anybody? The first, this is not a joke. The first study reporting that red wine could benefit you in Alzheimer's came from a group in Bordeaux, France.
Not than that. Not than that.
Now, everyone, so it goes this way. Apparently, drinking a moderate amount of red wine lowers your risk from individuals who don't drink red wine. But if you drink excessive red wine, it goes back up. So everyone wants to know, what is moderate? I don't know. Mr. Tucker says, I gave an example for a reason people may have missed an assessment was, I forgot the appointment. That happens. That happens. So he suggests that we make reminder phone calls. We are very much doing that. We are very making certain that we try to get people to come and to remind them of this. You know, there are 900 of you, and we try very hard, and Maria Carroll, who's our clinical operations manager, has got a crack staff to do this, but sometimes we can't connect with you or something, but we are trying to do this. Okay, this is a good one. I think, Joy, I'm going to bounce this one to you again. What about the antidepressants? I think we've mentioned at this meeting in the past that maybe antidepressants could be effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, so the antidepressants, particularly the class called the SSRIs, and I won't spell that out for you, but things like Lexapro, Paxil, drugs like that, have been studied for the last several years to see if they might be used as treatments. There was some initial studies done in mice, and you guys know we've cured Alzheimer's in mice many, many times, that showed that these drugs might affect that beta amyloid protein. And some of you may have participated in studies here looking at effects of those drugs on the spinal fluid. We ran those studies a few years ago. So those, we don't know yet. Those studies are still ongoing in people. So promising in mice, studies are ongoing in people. A small pilot study, again, was promising, but something that still needs to be studied. But those drugs are effective for depression or low mood, and we do know that low mood is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and maybe even having depression that's not treated is a bigger risk factor. So if your mood is low, not just every now and then, but consistently, good thing to talk to your doctor about it and get that treated, because that not only affects your life, but may increase your risk of Alzheimer's.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Schindler, the results you showed of the blood test study and showed significant difference between the two groups, but also it looked like there was a lot of overlap of those data. So is this, and I think you even mentioned that there could be false positives, how can these tests be refined?
Well, part of it is just trying to get the technique as good as it can be, because there's a very small difference between the amyloid positive and an amyloid negative group. So you're trying to measure something very, very precisely. So that's really refining the technique in the lab. Perhaps a bigger part of this is there may just be a limitation to how good this test can be, because blood is not in contact with the brain. There's a separation, and there may be a limit. It's also possible that we may find other substances in the brain that could help us. So maybe amyloid by itself doesn't give us a totally clear answer, but if we measure 3 or 4 things that can help. I think that's certainly a possibility, and there's another protein called neurofilament light that a lot of people are interested in looking at. But I think that whatever we do, it's not going to be a perfect test, and that's why we're thinking about it primarily as a screening test for the time being.
Okay, so I'm going to end this with a hope, but a cautiously optimistic hope. A question came, will the Knight ADRC be involved in research and therapies directed at targets other than amyloid? For example, tau. We've talked about tau. I want you to know that we really do have remarkable investigators in the Knight ADRC. David Holtzman's been mentioned. One of the drugs that Dr. Snyder presented that's being used in that A4 study is a drug that was developed in Dr. Holtzman's laboratory. And he licensed it to Eli Lilly Company, and they're the ones that are finding out if it's going to be effective. Dr. Holtzman's laboratory has developed an antibody to tau protein, and another drug company has licensed that, and they're launching a trial using his antibody as well. If the ADRC is going to be involved in it, we think we need a new initiative, and that is a unit of the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center that isn't engaged in annual assessments and getting PET scans and lumbar punctures to understand Alzheimer's and preclinical Alzheimer's, to take what we do in research and keep it in research, but develop a staff that does clinical trials only, dedicated to doing clinical trials, rather than trying to piggyback on, because we only have so much capacity to do clinical trials. So fortunately, we've had Dr. Snyder lead this effort, and she's acquired some funding to allow us to begin this clinical trials unit. We need some more funding, and we're working on a number of avenues to develop that. And then we need the appropriate staff. But I think the answer to the question, will we be involved in tau research, we very much are. We want to be involved in tau therapy research as well. So we do plan to do that. So I have 10:58. I see Dr. Mulder is coming up with one last hot question. Okay, so the question, this comes up a lot, and it's a good question. 2 things. Is Alzheimer's disease inherited? And are women more at risk? So let me take the latter one first. Maybe women are more at risk of Alzheimer's than men, but a lot of it, maybe all of it, is women are the stronger sex. They live longer. They live longer. And so whether it's the fact that being female allows you to live longer, that puts you more at risk for Alzheimer's. But Daniel Blash also talked about caring for his stepdad who had Alzheimer's. And women, by far and away, are the primary caregivers. So yes, more women get it, they live longer, but even if men get it, almost always it's women who are caregivers. Second, hereditary. That's the second leading cause of Alzheimer's disease. One is getting older, that's number one. Number two is we inherit from our parents certain genes that may put us at more risk or may protect us against certain illnesses. We're all combinations of our parents' genetic influences. My parents, for example, both came from, their ancestry was Northern Europe, Germany and Scandinavia and the British Isles. People there are quite pale skinned. I'm very pale skinned. I inherited that from my parents. When I was a kid, that put me at great risk of getting a condition, sunburn, right? So did my pale skin, my genetic influence, cause me to get sunburn? I had to go out into the sun, right? So it doesn't cause it, but it puts it more at risk. Does that make sense? And that's why Alzheimer's can run in families. People share those risk factors. People can also share protective factors. There are some families where everyone lives long and keeps all their marbles, right? So that happens too. Listen, there are so many wonderful questions here. It's time, we can't answer them all. What we will do is go through them, and all the messages that you've given us we will pay attention to. Remember, if we didn't get to your question, you can ask it through that website, and we'll try to get specific answers to you. You are terrific. This program every year is for us to thank you for all that you give us. So give yourself a big round of applause.